Welcome everyone to this episode of The Talent Fix, a podcast where we delve into the innovative world of human resources and talent acquisition. Today, we're thrilled to have a very special guest, Charlotte Melkert, as the co-founder of Equalture. Charlotte has been revolutionising the recruitment landscape with an eye for fairness and a passion for disrupting the status quo. She's challenging the traditional reliance that companies have on CVs and really sort of transforming how we think about talent acquisition. So welcome, Charlotte. You might give us one or two lines maybe to add to that introduction.
Oh yeah! First of all, thanks for being here, and it was a pretty accurate one. So indeed, I'm in the talent space for 7-8 years now. Very passionate about how can we give everyone an equal opportunity to get hired for a job, while at the same time making sure that we can really predict whether someone is going to perform well. And as you mentioned in your introduction, we are going to touch upon it probably. The CV is not the most reliable tool, also not the most fair tool. So that's what we are trying to change a little bit.
Brilliant. So let's dive straight into it. And I think it's really interesting what you're trying to do, because it's so valuable for companies in the selection process if they can find a selection process that truly predicts, with greater accuracy, an individual's future performance with the business. So if you can maybe talk to us a bit about, the limitations of CV-based recruitment, and really what are the primary limitations of relying solely on CVs for candidate selection?
Yeah, so a little bit of history, but first CV ever was created by Leonardo da Vinci, I think 16th century, something like that. So that's a long time ago. And since the 1950s, so after the Second World War, companies started applying the CV more as sort of a standard method to assess suitability of a candidate. And over the last 100 years, a lot of studies have been conducted into what is it actually that predicts best how you're going to perform in a role. So most of those studies looked at your educational experiences, your previous work experiences, but also stuff as your cognitions, your intelligence, your behaviors that you show, structured interviews. So there's a large variety of things. And what all of those researchers have shown over the last couple of years is that especially previous experiences and your educational level are both very poor predictors of how you're going to perform. Whereas someone's cognitive ability, so again, that's basically your level of intelligence, and your behavior that you show in the workplace, those two have the highest predictability of how you're going to perform. And it's also a bit more fair, right? Because not everyone had the opportunity to go to university or work at a very privileged company, whereas cognition and behavior is just about you as a human being. So that's why we've said, hey, what if we help companies to shift away from purely basing their evaluations on job experience and education and focus a little bit more on cognition and behavior, as that's much more predictive of how you're going to perform.
Okay, super. And I think, it's interesting when you put it in the context of how long the CV has been around. I think it's definitely perhaps time for a change. So how do, if we look at maybe moving on to cognitive abilities and behavioral assessment, could you talk about and could you elaborate on how assessing, cognitive abilities and behaviors can lead to, better hiring outcome?
Yeah. So I think what we try to do when we look at someone's CV is we make assumptions. We draw conclusions from the information that we see there. So I think a very good example is someone's educational level. We mainly use that to make a prediction or assumption of how smart someone is. Same goes for your previous work experiences. If someone worked as a marketeer for 5 years versus someone who worked as a marketeer for 2 years, we probably think that the one with 5 years will do better. But research has shown that your educational degree has nothing to do with your level of intelligence. So there could be dropouts from university, or maybe people who did get a university degree but had to put a lot of effort into getting that degree. And the same applies for work experience. So maybe if we take the example of the marketeer, maybe there is a marketeer with 5 years of work experience and a marketeer of 2 years of work experience. But the one with 2 years of work experience has a very high learning ability, which is a cognitive trait. That will mean that you will be able to acquire new skills much more easily. So probably you are a better marketer in that sense, because you have from a cognitive point of view, you have the equipment to train yourself better and more effectively. So when shifting away from looking at work experience and education and making assumptions based on that, why not just measure those assumptions right away? So if you want to draw conclusions on someone's intelligence based on their educational level, why not just test for intelligence through a cognitive assessment? Or if you would like to know how someone works, how someone interacts with their team, instead of drawing conclusions from the CV, you could also just directly test for that. And that is what we try to do. So we are trying to stimulate our customers to steer away from making assumptions based on information and rather look for the data points that can directly prove what you're trying to measure.
So moving on. So what specific cognitive abilities and behaviors should recruiters focus on to predict high work performance?
If you look at cognition, there are two that are very important in today's workplace, but definitely also the workplace of the future. That's one, flexibility. I think a bit of a no-brainer. The workplace is changing heavily. Jobs are also changing. So the whole concept of agile working, it's a bit of a buzzword, but it's also true. Jobs are changing, so you need to be able to adapt to that change. And that is what flexibility will capture for you. And the other one that goes hand in hand with that is learning ability. So I think as an example, look at how ChatGPT, for example, influenced the world of working. People with a higher learning ability will be able to acquire new knowledge faster, but also, for example, adapt new technologies out there. So I think the workplace nowadays is much less about what are the specific hard skills that you should have in order to do the job, because hard skills change all the time. ChatGPT wasn't there 2 years ago, and nowadays I think at least 1/3 of the workforce is working with it sometimes. So it's much more about how fast and how effectively can you learn new things. So therefore, flexibility and learning ability definitely from a cognitive point of view. From a behavioral point of view, we know that's more personality, but we know that conscientiousness is a very high predictor of how you're going to perform. So the desire to do your work well in an accurate way, and in a responsible way, but also, for example, ownership. It's also one of the things that we measure in our platform, which is obviously super important. If you show a higher level of ownership, you have more commitment, intrinsic motivation to do your job well. But also,
by
for
ownership,
example,
you mean willing to take responsibility?
Responsibility and proactiveness, both.
Proactiveness, okay, good.
Yeah, the ownership is basically the combination of that. But also, for example, how do you handle feedback and give feedback to others? Because if the workplace is changing very quickly, that means that you will have to listen to your team members, but also make sure that they listen to you in order to keep adapting to that. So that is feedback handling is especially also one of the behaviors that is becoming increasingly important.
Okay, really interesting. So you mentioned skills there, and I just want to talk about that for a minute. So we're in the European Year of Skills. I'm chair of the Dublin Regional Skills Forum actually for the next 2 years as well. And our most recent webinar was on skills-based hiring, and which people can check out on renterrecruiter.com under our webinars page. And I think what we're seeing and what we're really promoting and pushing is this shift towards skills-based hiring, because in this world of massive skill shortages and talent shortages, if you shift towards a skills-based hiring, the data tells us that it'll increase your talent pipeline by up to 10x and have really positive impacts on diversity as well. So how do you integrate skills into the hiring process, when it comes to looking at competencies and behaviors as well?
Yeah, so maybe good to first quickly touch upon the definition of skills, because I think there are two categories: skills, competencies. It's terms that are being used a lot, and I think many of us have different definitions. My definition is there's a distinction between hard skills and soft skills. Hard skills, coding languages, working with certain platforms, those kinds of things. Soft skills are much more, you can also call transferable skills that you would need in a variety of roles in order to perform well. I just gave a couple of examples. Soft skills are basically competencies for us. So with our platform, we have a game-based assessment platform where we really focus on capturing a person's soft skills or competencies. And we mainly focus on cognition and behavior there. So how we do that is, if you would apply that to a hiring setting, is that normally a candidate would apply with a resume, maybe a motivation letter, but hopefully more and more organizations are shifting that out because of, ChatGPT will write your cover letter. So instead of they apply with our games, could be as an addition to the CV or as a replacement of the CV. So that from the get-go, we know exactly what kind of competencies they have. And once you know that, and you also know what are the types of competencies that we are looking for in a marketer, a sales executive, an engineer, a finance consultant, whatever, then you can instantly, in a very objective and scientific way, so that improve your hiring success, but also fairness, of course, of your process. See, hey, the candidate has these 5 different competencies. They match on the job of a sales executive, maybe that they're applying for. But actually, those competencies could also fit very well with a couple of other roles that we have in the organization. So that way, you can not only apply skill-based hiring to make the selection more fair and predictive, but you can also use it to do a little bit more matchmaking between candidates and roles, which I think in this talent shortage, it's something that you have to do, right? There are organizations who receive maybe 20, 30, 40,000 applicants a year, and most of them are instantly rejected, while they could be very suitable for other roles in the organization.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, 100%. And then if we move on to gamification, I think you mentioned it there, Charlotte. How does gamification transform the recruitment process? And could you give us maybe some examples of competencies like learning, analytical skills, feedback handling, assessed through gamification?
Yeah. So maybe good to briefly touch upon that. There are obviously traditional assessments out there in the market, like personality questionnaires, the classic number series, figure series test, those kinds of things. And then there's game-based assessments. That's what we went for when we decided to start Equalture, which basically means that a candidate really engages in a game. So it's not a multiple choice questionnaire or whatever, where we can capture the behavior that you show in that game. So it's no longer about how many answers did you get right or wrong, but what are all those different data points that we can collect on how you went through a game that can tell us something about how you will most likely perform in the workplace, which brings a couple of benefits. So game-based assessments are more inclusive. We've proven that regardless of your cultural background, age, gender, etc., you have the same chance to perform well on a game. And another huge benefit of gamification, and I think that ties very well into the concept of skill-based hiring, is if you want to move to skills-based hiring, then at the very start of the process, you should already have an indication of the skills and the competencies that someone masters. Well, that's usually something that you can grasp through a CV, not the most predictive.
Yeah.
And then usually assessments are being introduced later on in the process as some sort of a sanity check. That's also because most traditional assessments are quite long, boring, non-engaging. People most likely won't complete it if they're being asked to complete a 2-hour assessment at the start of the funnel. But because of the fact that games focus on a lot of data points throughout the games, it also means that it's much shorter. So with our games, you take 15 to 30 minutes to complete the games. And we have a full picture of who you are, which also enables organizations to put it at the very front of the funnel. So maybe a nice statistic is that we mainly work for medium-sized businesses to enterprise businesses, and almost 90% of all of our customers introduce our assessments at the very start of the funnel, because gamification doesn't necessarily lead to drop-off for candidates. So I think apart from the level of accuracy and removing some of the inclusion barriers compared to traditional assessments, gamification has the benefit that you can actually put it in the front of the funnel without losing candidates.
Brilliant. So it improves the engagement, and we see a huge fall off, don't we, in candidates, especially when application processes are too long drawn out. So I think if gamification can have an impact on that, that's fantastic. So I know if we move on to interviews, Charlotte, we're our next webinar at the end of April, which again, people can sign up for on our website, rentarecruiter.com. We'll take a deep dive into the interview and look at kind of transforming the interview experience. Your view, I know from speaking to you before, is that competency-based interviews are the most effective. So if you could talk to us a bit about why you think, competency-based interviews are, the most effective in terms of matching talent to jobs. And I mean, perhaps you can give us some tips on structuring these interviews for different job roles.
Yeah, no, definitely. So first of all, research has shown that structured interviews are more successful than unstructured interviews. So I would recommend everyone to always think about the structure of the interview before they go into the interview. So what are the type of questions that you're going to ask to a candidate? How are you going to rate candidates also on the answers they provide? What is for you a desirable and an undesirable answer to that question? That's something I would always recommend. And you also don't need an assessment tool for that. You can also just think of questions that you would like to ask upfront. How we do it in our platform is, a candidate completes the games as part of their job application, and their results are being compared to what we call a competency profile, which basically means if the candidate completed an assessment focused on analytical thinking, does their level of analytical thinking match the level that we were looking for in the competency profile? Then what we do is we provide our customers with an automatically generated interview guide that is based on the specific results of a candidate, which also means that if you, for example, interview a candidate who scored very high on flexibility and a candidate who scored a bit lower on flexibility, there will different questions to ask to those candidates. And also, if one candidate scored within the competency profile on flexibility, we wouldn't necessarily recommend to take a deep dive into that specific competency, because you already know that the candidate has the level that you need. But if the candidate scored outside of the competency profile, then we do recommend you to ask some more flexibility, and we provide you then with those questions. So that means that I think we go a little bit against the general advice that you have to ask the exact same question
to each candidate. Exactly. That was my next question, but go on. Yeah. So does it impact fairness? Does it impact fairness?
Well, the reason that from a research point of view, you're recommended to ask the same questions to candidates is usually in an interview, you would like to get a better understanding of competency. So the CV is more sort of a sanity check, and then the interview is more for competencies. But if you did not ask a candidate to complete an assessment up front, you also have zero insights in their competencies. So then it makes perfectly sense to ask everyone the exact same set of questions, so that you also have something to benchmark candidates, to compare different candidates with each other. However, if you already do know their competencies before you go into the first interview, in my opinion, it doesn't make any sense to ask people the same questions, because what you do want to ensure is that every candidate has the same opportunity to explain their strengths, their weaknesses, but more importantly, hey, I have specific weaknesses, but do I have some sort of mechanisms in place to cope with those? So if, let's say, flexibility would be one of your competencies, and you would ask every candidate questions about flexibility, some candidates don't have the opportunity to touch upon the competencies for which they did not meet your requirements. And I think that is eventually causing more unfairness in the interview process.
Okay, no, good answer. And if we talk about we're coming to the end now, Charlotte. So just a couple of questions I want to ask you before I let you go. For HR managers who are looking to innovate their recruitment process, what are the first steps, to moving away from maybe a CV-centric approach?
Well, first of all, that happens long before the hiring process starts. I firmly believe that every organization eventually should shift more from an experience-driven organization to a competency-driven organization. So what are the type of skills that I need for specific jobs to be done, regardless of what you did before? That requires crystal clear insights into what are the competencies that we then need for different types of roles within the organizations. If you don't get that right, then the rest of your process will be a mess because you will reject or hire people for the wrong competency. So I'd always recommend to first start with a very thorough analysis of what kind of jobs do we have in the organization and what kind of competencies should people have in order to perform well. An assessment, by the way, can come in very handy there because you can obviously use an assessment in the recruitment process, but you can also use it for your internal workforce to say, hey, let people complete the assessment, categorize the people in your organization, for example, based on performance, and compare those groups with each other. So if you have a group of high-performing customer support employees, compare them to the group of low-performing customer support employees and see if there are any differences in the assessment results. That will probably help you identify, hey, these are the competencies that predict success and these are the ones that are a bit less relevant. You can also do that, of course, manually by sitting down with the hiring managers and talk about, hey, who are the individuals that you're very happy with? What do they have in common? And who are the individuals that you are not so happy with and what do they actually have in common? Then you will also probably find the pattern. So I'd say always start with that. And then on top of that, I know that might sound biased because it's a business that I have, but there are thousands of assessments out there. But do start using an assessment if you would like to get an objective overview of someone's skills and talents, because it will always be more accurate than a human being doing it. But if you don't have the resources, for example, to do that, a very easy hack could be to, let's say that you would like to hire someone for a position that requires analytical thinking. Just go to ChatGPT, generate 10 questions to ask to candidates to learn more about their analytical thinking skills, pick the right one that works for you, and include that in your job application form so that candidates no longer only have to upload their resume, but also have to answer that question. That way, you basically get the insights already that you would normally get for a job interview, which is a bit more time intensive for the candidate. So be aware that you don't ask like 10 or 20 questions, but it does give you more insights already into their competency. So it's not the most efficient way to go about it, but if you don't have the budget for tooling, that could be a manual way to start doing it.
Great advice. And I think just one point you mentioned there, I think is really valuable. And it's often a lot of the solutions to these issues often happen at the beginning of the process, like investing time at the beginning of the process to understand, what skills and competencies you're looking for. And I really like that idea of just even sitting down with the hiring manager, to understand what are the competencies and traits that the high performing individuals in your team possess. So final question. Sorry, Charlotte, go on.
No, so I think that's one golden question. I don't know who told that to me, but I think it's a very nice one, that if you open a role and you sit down with the hiring manager, let's say you open a role for a digital marketer. Let's use that example again. And the hiring manager has someone in their team who's really the top performer. Ask that hiring manager, hey, if this person would leave the organization tomorrow, which skills are lost in your team? What would cause a gap in your team that you would have to fill that someone else doesn't have in your team currently? Then probably slowly the competencies will rise to the surface that distinguish that top performer from the rest of the team. And that could at least be the starting point for, hey, these are the competencies that we should focus on.
Great question to ask. Brilliant. And then final question for you, Charlotte. Looking to the future, what kind of trends do you foresee in recruitment practices?
A tough market. The market is tough, will be tough. Like we have economic conditions, I think. But on top of that, the talent shortage will only get bigger. I think that talent acquisition, unfortunately, still seems to be the business unit of an organization that organizations tend to cut as soon as sales is worse than expected or whatever. But I hope that trend is going to change. That talent acquisition will become a more strategic part of the organization, because eventually, whether you're a tech company, service company, whatever, it's the people in your company that determine success. And I hope that the talent shortage that is already painful, but will get even more painful, is a mental reminder for all those boardrooms out there that this should be a strategic pillar. And what I also foresee is the talent shortage forces people to move more to skill-based hiring. Whether you like it or not, you just have to do it, because there won't be enough qualified candidates based on their CVs. And we also know that skills-based hiring leads to more diversity within your teams, because it does open a talent pool for people who don't meet all the requirements. So I hope that as a side effect of the talent shortage, we can finally take some actual steps to make sure that the hiring process becomes a bit more fair and leads to a more diverse workforce.
Brilliant. And then just finally, Charlotte, where can companies go to, find you and to find out more about how they can maybe implement your platform, integrate the platform into the business?
Yeah, well, you can just message me on LinkedIn, but you can also go to equalture.com. There you can find more info or book a demo, of course.
Fantastic. Well, look, Charlotte, thanks so much for your time today. And thanks for listening. Check us out where you get your podcasts on Apple and Spotify.